Good evening, everyone. I'm so delighted to have you join us today. I'm Elizabeth Goldstein, the president of MAS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our third session in our Towards Comprehensive Planning series. This series was conceived because many New Yorkers are seeking a more coordinated and collaborative approach to land use planning and wrestling with how to increase community partnerships in land use decisions. Just about a year ago, City Council Speaker Corey Johnson released Planning Together, a new comprehensive planning framework for New York City. This report and accompanying legislation outline what comprehensive planning could look like in New York City. This proposal, still under consideration for potential vote by the end of this year, as the transition of one administration to another, could potentially bring significant changes to every level of government. Tonight, we will focus on how comprehensive planning frameworks intersect with the preservation of historic and cultural resources. We will examine how current preservation laws and policies function in New York, and comparatively, how cities including Philadelphia and Los Angeles have tackled this. As you know, historic preservation here in New York, like cities across the country, is seeking to diversify its interest and reach. From uplifting the stories of Stonewall and the communities of Weeksville and Sandy Ground, we are making progress towards that goal. However, our very strong landmarks law is struggling to incorporate sites of historic importance with little or no architectural integrity. In addition, city tools for identifying and commemorating non-place-based histories is weak. The truth is that planning for historic preservation doesn't really have a home either at the Landmarks Preservation Commission or at the Department of City Planning. All the more reason why I'm looking forward to this conversation this evening with our fabulous panelists. Before we get started, I'd like to draw your attention to the chat, where the MAS team has placed some helpful tips and details. There is also a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. There you can share any questions that you might have, and we'll get to them a little bit later in the program. And now it's my enormous pleasure to introduce our panelists for this conversation. First, Ken Bernstein is the principal city planner for the Los Angeles Department of City Planning, for which he leads the city's Office of Historic Resources. Since 2006, he has overseen the completion of Survey LA, a multi-year citywide survey of historic resources, and has led the creation of the Comprehensive Historic Preservation Program for Los Angeles. He is also the author of a recently released book, Preserving Los Angeles: How Historic Places Can Transform American Cities, which was just included in the top urban planning books of 2021, compiled by Plant Netizine. Congratulations, Ken, and welcome. Our next guest is Chris Cirillo, who is the executive director and president of the East Harlem-based Ascendant Neighborhood Development Corporation, where he's been since July 2012. Since arriving at Ascendant, Chris has expanded the organization's work to include neighborhood planning, historic preservation, and asset management. He is deeply involved in urban issues facing New York and has helped to establish the Northern Manhattan Collaborative and the landmark East Harlem. MAS is also pleased to have his expertise on our planning committee and as a partner on the Thriving Communities Coalition. And last but not least, Dominique Hawkins is the managing partner and principal of the Preservation Design Partnership, which she established in 1995. Her work is at the forefront of addressing change at historic building and sightings level, whether through design or the regulatory process. In 2017, Dominique served as the vice chair of the Philadelphia Historic Preservation Commission Task Force, created by Mayor Jim Kinney, as well as co-chair of its regulatory committee. This task force served to review policies that supported historic preservation in the city and to make recommendations on how to strengthen those policies and inform Philadelphia's 2035 comprehensive plan. So let's start the conversation. I'd like to start this evening with you, Chris, and if I can just ask you, if you would, to share some of your views about the state of both planning and preservation in New York today.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks to MAS for convening this conversation and for inviting me to participate. I'm gonna just hold on one second. Screen sharing. Okay, can you see my screen? Great, thank you. So as Elizabeth mentioned in her introduction, I wear a few different hats. Running a nonprofit organization based in Northern Manhattan, I spend my days working on preserving and developing affordable housing in East and Central Harlem. I'm also a recent graduate of the Historic Preservation Program at Pratt, and I now teach there. And one of the courses I teach is called Current Issues in Historic Preservation. And one of the things that we focus on with our students is really this question of how to use preservation and preservation tools to address current issues in our society, in our city. And so this question of comprehensive planning and its intersection with preservation is so timely and important. And I want to focus a little bit on the work that we've been doing in East Harlem and what I think it says about the current state of planning and preservation planning specifically, and where we have some gaps in New York, and what I hope we can learn this evening from the experiences of Philadelphia and Los Angeles. For those of you who are familiar with East Harlem, it's an amazingly historic and vibrant neighborhood. Our organization was founded here in 1988 when the neighborhood had faced several decades of disinvestment and deterioration. And so we got involved in developing and preserving affordable housing. Over the course of the last 10 years, as new development pressures and displacement pressures have increased, and with the impending arrival of the phase 2 of 2nd Avenue subway and the development that will come along with that, concerns are increasing in the neighborhood about preservation, about the loss of community, the loss of our historic fabric. And I think what we see in the neighborhood is kind of indicative of some problems that we see across New York City. And this map shows kind of where our portfolio is located, but I'm showing it mainly to highlight the areas that are outlined in purple. And these are studies that we've undertaken and helped to partially fund, and for which we've secured grant funding from partners at the Preservation League of New York State and the New York Landmarks Conservancy. We started with the 116th Street corridor and were successful in getting the first state and National Register Historic District listed, over 800 properties back in 2019. Our second study area up in the northwest corner of East Harlem and spilling over a bit into Central Harlem has been deemed eligible, and we're now working on getting it nominated and listed. And just this past year, we secured another grant and are now doing a cultural resources survey of the entire southern half of the neighborhood, over 1,200 parcels. And I show this map mainly to point out kind of what we're trying to do, and also the fact that we as a local nonprofit are doing this work. This isn't work that's being done by our Department of City Planning. It's not being done by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. We're having to take it on ourselves because if you look at this next map, you can see where the disparities exist. And so this is a part of the citywide map that the Landmarks Preservation Commission has on its website, indicating historic districts and individually designated landmarks in the city. And if you can see my arrow, I'm kind of highlighting where East Harlem is, and you can see that there are a lot fewer pink dots and there are no yellow historic districts anywhere in East Harlem. We're one of the most under-designated areas of the city, and one of the most underrepresented. And it's really unfortunate. You know, it's the neighborhood is vibrant and amazing. You know, I'm just going to run through a couple of slides really quickly and then turn it over to the other panelists. But just to highlight some of the things that we're missing and some of the gaps that we have. This is one of our local firehouses. It's a mirror image of a building in Far Rockaway that the Landmarks Preservation Commission designated a few years ago, but ours isn't designated. And there's no reason for that, except that the way we do preservation planning is piecemeal. And things like this are, what fall through the cracks when we don't comprehensively look at what our resources are and what we should be protecting. This is another one, another public building, the Manhattan Grit Chamber. You might notice it as you drive past on the FDR Drive. Amazing Art Deco structure tucked away in the eastern riverfront side of the neighborhood, also unprotected. Although its companion in the Bronx is a designated landmark. We have amazing educational institutions and schools. One of the only schools from the mid-20th century in New York City to have a glass curtain wall. This one's also not designated. We have amazing religious institutions. Here's a historic tax photo of a church on 111th Street and Lexington Avenue, originally a Baptist church. This is what it looks like today. And you might think, the architectural historians who might be listening in might think, wow, the building had a major fire in the mid-20th century and it was partly rebuilt. But what's really interesting and important about this building is it is the church that was occupied by the Young Lords twice, actually, during their activism around the lack of city services and the lack of attention that the neighborhood was receiving from city government in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so it has amazing cultural and historical importance to the neighborhood. It was calendared for consideration and then decalendared by the Landmarks Preservation Commission without taking action. Another one for folks who appreciate fine architecture, beautiful row of brownstones in East Harlem in the northwest corner of the neighborhood. You might walk down the street and think, oh, that poor building in the center there, it lost its cornice. But then I might show you this photo, which may be familiar to you, and it's the same building. This is the Great Day in Harlem famous photo of amazing jazz musicians all gathered on one day and photographed on the stoop of this building. Also not protected, not a historic district, not an individual landmark. And then I just want to end on this slide because this is something that we're really grappling with right now in East Harlem due to our concentration of public housing. But really across the city. Our public housing has faced decades of disinvestment at all levels of government. It's an immensely important resource for affordable housing, but it's also a historical resource as well. And how we recognize and appreciate the history of public housing and affordable housing and how we preserve and protect it for future generations is something that we desperately need to grapple with. So I'll end off there and turn it back over to Elizabeth.
Great, thank you, Chris. That's a wonderful little overview of some of the challenges that we're facing in New York. Dominique, I really would like to turn to you next and really ask you to share a little bit about the amazingly thoughtful work that you've done and the Philadelphia Historic Preservation Commission Task Force did. So if you could share that, that'd be great. You are muted.
Okay, so the Philadelphia Preservation Task Force, it was an incredible volunteer effort by a lot of people. It was like wrangling cats. So this is a brief overview of what we as a group did, and hopefully to provide better protection for Philadelphia's historic resources. So the task force was really initiated as a response to incredible numbers of demolitions of historic buildings across the city. And everyone was always stunned that their favorite building in their neighborhood was not designated. And as a result, the mayor convened the Philadelphia Historic Preservation Task Force to come at a solution as to how to make preservation more accessible across the city and what that actually meant. So this had a lot of funding and a lot of work. We were very fortunate to get some foundation funding. We worked through the Philadelphia Department of Planning and Development, which is the umbrella organization for planning, as well as community development, and the Historical Commission sits under that. Although we didn't technically work with the commission, this was really meant to be an independent review of the process and where we can have improvements. We also got some technical assistance from the National Trust, and we had a consultant who helped guide us through the process. So the membership of the museum was crazy town. So we had everybody at the table, and I used to chair the architectural committee of the Philadelphia Historical Commission, sat on the commission, and I was literally sitting across the table in the task force with people who were screaming at me at these commission meetings. So because there was no live application, so to speak, that was under consideration, everybody got to just say, okay, we all know we have problems with the way the system is working. How can we come together and figure out a way to make the system better? So looking at Philadelphia, this is similar to the map of New York. Local designation is where all the regulatory stuff happens. There's a lot in the center of the center city, which is kind of this dense area. And then this happens to be sort of where Washington slept, so to speak. George Washington slept everywhere in Philadelphia, and this is one of his neighborhoods. And then there's kind of a lot of money up there. But there's a lot of the city that's not designated. If we look at the National Register version of it, it's similar. So there are incredible historic resources across the city that are not being considered. So the mayor's task force was divided really into 4 groups. So one group that dealt with the regulatory process, one with how to survey the city and what that meant. Another with, can we provide incentives to encourage people to think about preservation in a different way? And the 4th was how to deal with education and outreach. So we took this larger group of 33 people and divided the pie and met as smaller groups. We started talking about the current state of preservation. So we were open and frank about what we thought was right and what we thought was wrong. There was, in fact, a lot right. Our ordinance, for example, is really good. We looked at best practices across the country, and the National Park Service, the National Trust for Historic Preservation provided us with a lot of information. And then we had to kind of filter it down and say, well, that's great, that works in New Orleans, but does it work in Philadelphia? And what is our sort of laws and our enabling legislation, and does that jive? We came up with recommendations, and then we presented the final recommendations to the mayor. How do we get it done? We met. Boy, did we meet. I think I went to about 40 meetings, given all my various roles within a year. There was a lot of public meeting as well as the subcommittees. So each of these committees were meeting, and we were meeting as groups. And then we were meeting on the side. So we try to talk to as many people as possible. There was also a citizen component of this. So a different organization known as Penn Praxis, which is affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania, actually met with citizens in their living rooms and in their kitchen tables to talk about what are the things you want to save in the city, what are important things for you, and how can we make that happen? So the recommendations that came out, there were a series of 8 recommendations that came out. And the book is available online, so I don't want to sort of dwell on any of it. But one of the most important, I think, recommendations that came out is that we needed a mechanism for preservation that was more accessible to people. And there's a financial hurdle to being as compliant as the existing rules are with the Philadelphia Historical Commission. So is there a way to broaden our reach by making it incentivizing people to want to do preservation versus new development, as well as to make it so that people felt like they were part of the process. So the outcomes, what has happened since this process has concluded, which was really just before COVID, we really launched this in, I think it was April of 19. So really as all the world was shutting down, is the city still has worked on this, and I give them I commend them for it. So they have adopted 3 incentive legislation bills, And these are all no cost, meaning there's no financial aspect of it, but the idea is to make it more beneficial for people to consider preservation instead. So they adopted a plan to do a neighborhood preservation that is different than the typical historic district. So it'd be a lower level of compliance. They currently have received proposals from consultants to identify and survey and document places that matter. And I'm not using preservation specifically because it also includes tangible and intangible properties. And they're getting ready to start a survey of the city. And so I think given particularly pandemic, the needle has moved very far. And all of this is informing the larger conservation planning process that is currently underway in the city. And this seems like a great time to turn it over to Ken.
And by all means, thank you, Dominique. And I would love to invite Ken to talk a little bit about what's happened in LA, which involves some extraordinarily daunting survey work in as big a sprawling city as LA. But I'll let him describe this in his own words.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. It's really a pleasure to be with you and with MAS. It's an honor. I am obviously from Los Angeles, but I try to keep tabs on what's happening in New York more so these days. My son is now living in the city and has joined us tonight. He is an MAS member and getting active in his own Upper West Side community and on housing issues in New York. So I'm very interested in all the work of MAS. As was mentioned in my introduction, I've written this book called Preserving Los Angeles, How Historic Places Can Transform America's Cities. And I think of it kind of as a coffee table book with a message. And that message really is about our topic tonight, linking historic preservation to long-range planning in our cities. You may not think LA is much like New York, but in many ways, there are tremendous similarities. We are a dynamic, constantly changing city, experiencing continual growth and evolution. And so all of us in preservation have to grapple with this central question of how can a city best move forward and manage change that's constant in our cities without losing its past, while still anchoring ourselves in the best of our past. And from my perch, really leading the second largest historic preservation program in the country behind New York, what I wanted to do in the book was to share how, in fact, preservation has been a primary engine for driving change in our city, and that can be done in other cities around the country, that preservation has been revitalizing our downtown, leading to economic regeneration in many of our neighborhoods, helping to create new housing, and really providing more inclusive and equitable representation of all of our communities and cultures in the city. And in thinking about tonight's topic about comprehensive planning and preservation, we have done a bit in Los Angeles to include preservation language in our citywide policy plans, and that type of kind of lofty policy language is important. It's nice, but I wanted to really emphasize tonight that the central way we have tried to infuse preservation into comprehensive planning is through historic resource surveys. And simply put, you can't plan for the future of a constantly changing city or really have a sense of where preservation could fit into that future unless you know what and where your historic resources are in the first place. And that is really a base starting point. And that you can use to help guide long-range planning and decide where to accommodate more intense development, where you want to protect historic resources and historic neighborhoods. And that's what we sought to do through our citywide survey, Survey LA, a multi-year partnership between the city and the J. Paul Getty Trust. It was a daunting task in Los Angeles, encompassing over 470 square miles, 880,000 parcels across the city. It ended up creating our citywide inventory shown here, our website, historicplacesla.org. And this was a process that involved creating new technological tools. This was the first all digital citywide survey in the country. And we worked closely with professional consultants to do the survey field work, but informed very much by a very robust historic preservation outreach program, a community participation program, to make sure that we were extending beyond just the identification of significant architecture in the city to take in the unique social and cultural landmarks of our city that wouldn't be obvious even to trained architectural historians. So we did considerable outreach months before we were in the field in any given community. And I have to give great credit to MAS. We were very much inspired by your Place Matters project in New York, identifying places that matter of social and cultural significance. The main difference was that we made sure that that was really infused into the city process from the very beginning and really guided our citywide survey. But we owe that approach very much to MAS and your work in New York. Dominique and Chris showed maps and numbers about historic designations just very quickly in LA. It's important to point out that we have about 1,200 local landmarks or city historic cultural monuments, 35 historic districts with about 21,000 properties. Everything we identified in Survey LA citywide added another 30,000 or so eligible historic resources. But it's important to point out that that is still about 6% of all of the 880,000 parcels in the city. So the survey also pointed us to the fact that 94% of our city are places that we don't think have historic or architectural or cultural significance, and are areas where new development and change is still very much possible. We organized the survey explicitly to link long-range planning and historic preservation around the 35 community plans in the city that are mini cities in themselves, populations often of 100 to 200,000 people. And together, these community plans add up to the land use element of our comprehensive plan, the general plan of Los Angeles, that is guided by an overall citywide growth strategy to focus growth around transit and infrastructure. And then it's at the community plan level where we do what you do in New York through some of your rezoning programs, like in Soho or Midtown East, where you're doing comprehensive rezonings. We do that through the community plan. But Survey LA was informing, again, where we should be doing some of those rezonings. And we were able to put in place with the community plans protections, such as what we called character residential districts for residential neighborhoods that were determined eligible for historic designation, like this one in South LA, the Vermont Knolls neighborhood. They weren't quite ready to be a historic district designated at the time. It's a neighborhood that's a very stable community of largely African-American homeowners in South LA. But this, the community plan, because of Survey LA, was able to put in place protections. And now this neighborhood actually is looking at historic status more officially. And I want just to finish by saying a few words about the intersection of preservation and planning for housing, which are central issues for us in LA, as I know they are in New York. And one of the key successes we've had is through what's called our adaptive reuse ordinance that facilitated the conversion of historic commercial buildings to housing. We had over 75 projects in downtown LA alone, creating more than 12,000 new housing units. This is the subway terminal building, a 1925 building downtown that created 277 new apartments downtown using historic preservation incentives along the way. And we've seen adaptive reuse of many other projects for affordable housing, such as this one, the Boyle Hotel in our community of Boyle Heights, as you can see, about a mile from downtown LA. One of the oldest commercial blocks in the city from the 1880s, 30 affordable units in the historic building, and in addition as well with 21 additional 100% affordable units, the opportunity for preservation to be part of the housing solution, part of comprehensive planning in that way. So I will stop with this image from my book, The Binoculars. This is our youngest landmark in the city, historic cultural monument that Ples Oldenburg, the artist, worked with Frank Gehry, the architect, on the Chiat Day building in Venice. And I wanted to end with this to really encourage us to think about preservation as a forward-looking endeavor. So often we are pigeonholed, I think wrongly, in the preservation community of being kind of a fussy, backward-looking movement, and we want to look forward at what the future of the preservation movement brings, and to use these binoculars to look at our cities through the lens of historic preservation. So I will stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much to all of you. Those were wonderful introductions. And I guess I want to start off by just asking a question of our audience. We're just curious about how you're feeling about whether New York City should do a comprehensive survey, as has been done in LA and might be done, we hope, in Philadelphia as well. As Dominique indicated, was recommended by her task force. So if you would take a minute to take a look and share your answer with us, we'll share the results momentarily with everyone. But while we're waiting for those results, let me turn to you first, Dominique, because I was intrigued by something that went by, and I know it's true in LA too, but I think you described the structure in Philadelphia about the relationship between the planning department and the Historic Preservation Commission. And I was wondering if you could just describe that a little more fully, so that we can understand how it works in Philadelphia.
Be happy to. So in 2017, the city of Philadelphia, the citizens of Philadelphia actually voted to pull together planning community development under one umbrella, and the Historical Commission joined them. So prior to that, preservation was its own independent agency. It had its office separated from everybody else. Nobody talked to each other. And applicants were always going through a development process, were always confused as to who had the last word, because they were getting conflicting answers and conflicting direction from different entities in the city. So they now, everyone currently, I'll say, lives under the same roof, literally, and I'm saying that in the non-COVID sense of the words. So they all share office space, and they're able to actually come together and have conversations about both specific applications, as well as looking at neighborhoods and looking in a larger context of planning and what it means to include preservation in the larger city conversation.
And I know in LA, obviously, Ken, you are part of the planning department, and I suspect you will be very diplomatic, but there must be pros and cons to that. Can you highlight some of them for us?
There are, and I know, in terms of contrasting LA with New York, where there's a strong tradition of having an independent, standalone department, I think those contrasts are interesting. Historically, LA had a bifurcated preservation program. The individual landmarks were under our cultural affairs department, our arts department, and then the historic districts, our historic preservation overlay zones, were in the planning department. When we started Survey LA, this was discussed and had to decide where should this go. And I really think it was the right decision to put preservation nested within the planning department for the reasons I meant. Now, partly I come from the perspective of an urban planner and really about linking preservation and planning, but I think there is tremendous advantage. So much of what we do in preservation really comes down to both the long range plans, as I mentioned, the opportunities to infuse preservation policies and survey knowledge into those long range planning strategies and how we grow as a city. The day-to-day zoning decisions on planning entitlement applications, those zoning approvals that come in, also come through our department. And again, we're able to have discussions about environmental review and impacts and project conditions, and really play a role with our project planners in making sure that that happens. I think the drawback, I mean, there are times when it would be wonderful to have the kind of autonomy and authority and be at the table with other city general managers in the same way and be on an even playing field in that respect, and to have control of our own budget during difficult times and that sort of thing. But I think, to me, the advantages of really being on par, being in the same room, working side by side with planners day to day, and not being in silos where we have to work across those agencies, I think is invaluable to our work day to day.
And I want to turn to you, Chris, both about this question. Obviously, you are working in New York City in a place where we do have very strong but very separate regulatory processes, one for preservation, one for planning. And obviously, as a practitioner, you must have grappled with this from a practical level. And I'm just curious whether you have any observations about the strengths and weaknesses of the New York process by comparison.
Yeah, I think, I've been working in East Harlem in my current job for almost 10 years now. Prior to that, I worked for a private developer doing development in East Harlem. And before that, for 10 years for the city's housing department in East Harlem and elsewhere. And since 2003, the neighborhood has been targeted 3 different times for 3 major upzonings to accommodate more and more development. And there has never been a comprehensive survey of the cultural resources and historical resources in the neighborhood. That's all work that we are grappling with as volunteers and, people that I work with in Landmark East Harlem who are volunteers and us as a small nonprofit organization trying to fill the gaps there. And I think, it speaks to this disconnect between a Department of City Planning that doesn't work under a mandate of doing a comprehensive plan and doesn't see it as part of its mission to do comprehensive planning for the city, and a Landmarks Preservation Commission that is strong in its own right and independent, and that many of us value for that for a lot of reasons. But that disconnect means we're losing a lot. It means that our identification and designation processes are more driven by requests. They're not part of comprehensively looking at the city, looking at all neighborhoods, taking any sort of equity lens about what has been protected, whose stories are being told and preserved, and what parts of the city are being completely overlooked and underprotected. I don't know if moving landmarks under city planning is the right thing to do. I think that only makes sense if it's part of a larger transformation of how we do planning and how we do our rezonings, so that it's a much more comprehensive process. Because simply putting landmarks under city planning now, the way it's currently set up with no comprehensive plan, doesn't seem like a recipe for success. But what we're doing now isn't working either. So
tell us what you really think, Chris.
If I could add one thing to that, I'm sorry. So
please.
One of the things, again, this was part of what the task force was encouraging, is because planning was making decisions without considering historic preservation, which is why I think it's so great the two got brought together. So there was a lot of upzoning done in Philadelphia, which then increased development pressure on parcels where, you have a 3-story row house kind of building that suddenly you can build a 10-story building. So everyone's just doing the math. And they're figuring out that makes sense. So part of the recommendations of the task force were really to reconcile that. So as Ken pointed out, you have to know where the important historic parts are and what people want to save, and then look at the zoning and make sure that those things are aligned so that the incentive to build is reduced. And perhaps provide incentive for preservation on the other end. So all of this is so intertwined, is what we all came away with at the end.
Interesting. We've had a couple of questions from the audience which sort of reflected and maybe articulate even better than I was going to phrase this. So I'm going to turn to them about the tensions between preservation and affordable housing and other kinds of development. And I'll just read out both of these questions to you and look to whoever would like to take them first. The first is New York is facing a large turnover in the city council, which is absolutely true. We've got about 2/3 of our council will be new representatives shortly. What would you do to highlight the value of historic preservation as part of a well-considered planning approach, as opposed to a hindrance to new housing and growth? And would a citywide survey really help to highlight the opportunities in every neighborhood across the city? Is one question. And the other, just to throw them both out at once, is, in your experience, how do you reconcile the perceived opposition of community economic development and historic preservation? So I'm going to throw that out and let whoever would like to go first tackle that question, or those questions, as the case may be.
Dominique, you want to go first and I'll jump in?
Of course I do. So, I think it comes down to, politicians react to what the citizens want. So the outcry in Philadelphia that led to the formation of the task force was one of everyone sort of hair on fire. They're tearing down all of our important buildings. I think engaging people in a process that asks them the basic question, what's important to you, and what are the tools you need to say what's important to you in your neighborhood, really is the root of it. So if the citizens are saying, hey, this corridor where all of my retail shops and my church and my synagogue and my mosque are all located is what's important to us in our neighborhood, then that city council person will react to it. And we've had different moments in Philadelphia where we've had, or not moments, time periods, we've had these historic districts on the books ready to go, but the council person was a no, an absolute no. And part of what this preservation light, as we're talking about this democratization of preservation, is saying, okay, why is it a no? Is it a no because you don't want to put wood windows in? Okay, if we take that away, can we get the neighbors to say yes? So we're saving the buildings and worry about the fussy details later. But it's part of a conversation, and you have to invite people to start by saying what's important.
So I would say, in California, this is really the central issue of this moment in the last few years. This tension is particularly with affordable housing, housing supply, and historic preservation. And preservation is still perceived or misperceived by many as being an impediment, standing in the way of new housing development. And I touched on some of the ways we're trying to respond to that. But I think it's going to become even more urgent over these next few years. Our city council just adopted our new housing element of our general plan, our comprehensive plan, just a couple of weeks ago. And the housing element under our state law now, state is coming down with many new housing mandates. The housing element has much more meaning. We actually have to demonstrate that we have housing capacity by rezoning the city to meet any both current and kind of historic shortfalls in both market rate and affordable housing in the city. For LA, that means that we have to rezone our city entirely over the next 3 years to accommodate more than 200,000 new housing units. And that is a huge task. And again, it will, I think, put to a test the ability of us to utilize some of the survey information, some of the strategies that we've used thus far to protect communities while we rezone. I think it's fortunate that we do have the survey in place now as we begin that process. But we also need to look at how preservation can be part of the solution. And again, I mentioned adaptive reuse and the adaptive reuse ordinance. We're looking at maybe even the leading edge of that rezoning policy being something we've been calling adaptive reuse 2.0, kind of the next wave of the adaptive reuse ordinance, really extending that in a more concerted way beyond downtown and some of our major centers citywide, removing some of the impediments that have made it difficult to use that program in some areas of the city. Look at accessory dwelling units as well. And I think that pushing back a little at times, I think on some of the perhaps fussiness in the preservation community, we're going to need to accommodate second units or granny flats in areas that those are not visible or not having a detrimental impact to some of our historic districts. And that needs to be part of the solution as well, even while we do push back and ensure that historic resources and communities aren't upzoned in a way that put undue pressure on them.
Thank you to both of you. And speaking of adaptation, we've got a question here about some of the challenges that all of the panelists have probably experienced about the intersection between planning, preservation, and climate change. And are there particular projects and case studies that are positively balanced for the need for both climate adaptation and preservation? And I'm going to turn to you first, Dominique, because I know that some of the work that you've done in West Palm Springs has related to just that.
Well, thank you. I've actually done a few projects, a couple of statewide projects, both in Maryland and in New Jersey. And I'm currently doing Florida, really looking at the intersection of historic preservation, climate change, particularly around flooding, but also dealing with severe storms such as hurricanes. So basically there's a tool kit, and you have to balance the type of architecture, the level of threat, and the type of threat to be able to respond to what is the appropriate mechanisms or tools to use. And each community is different. You may have, storm in one place versus tidal flooding in another place versus, like a flash flooding or whatever it might be. So there's an emergence of these tools occurring. The National Park Service has also put out some guidance about how to address at a property level the specific levels of change. But the reality is that each community has to make the choices because the threats are specific. So FEMA is not an animal that preservation is ever going to beat up, is probably the best way to put it. And so you have to start with understanding what FEMA's rules are, and then take a look at philosophically, what are you trying to save? What is important? And how much change are you willing to accept to balance the threat versus your desire to save your history?
Curious whether Ken or Ken?
So I think this is an area that, to be honest, I don't think we've done enough in Los Angeles. Historically, this is an area we've been very siloed, where much of the sustainability planning, climate planning that was taking place wasn't necessarily involving historic preservation planners. And we've begun to kind of insert ourselves into some of those conversations, since existing buildings do represent 40% of all carbon emissions. And looking at this and through the lens of what we're now calling climate heritage, we're part of the International Climate Heritage Network, this intersection of climate action and cultural heritage, and looking at the role we can play both in climate adaptation, having our historic communities become more climate resilient, as well as mitigation, minimizing carbon impacts. And I think, we're working now with our mayor's office and our municipal utility, our Department of Water and Power, to look at some pilot programs for energy retrofits of historic buildings in ways that won't negatively impact their historic character. And I would point again to some of our community planning work on adaptation, and some of our lower lying coastal communities, the Venice community, for those of you who know LA, a very architecturally and culturally rich community. It is at great risk of inundation from sea level rise in the coming decades. And that's a community where all these conversations are coming together. How do we adapt Venice to the coming change of climate, while also dealing with some really unique cultural resources, a historic African-American neighborhood in Venice, the Oakwood community, pressures of real estate and gentrification. It all comes together in this community planning program that we're now undertaking. But at least, again, it's informed by this information that we have from the survey and our historic preservation planning.
I'm going to turn to another question from our audience in just a minute, but I'm sure you all noticed that our survey didn't come up in quite the way that we had hoped. So if you would please answer the question about whether you think New York City should do a historic preservation survey in the chat, we will undertake to count the answers and give you some feedback. But I want to turn to a question that many of you, and I'll start with you, Chris, on this, because I know you touched on this, but I know all of you have been working on aspects of this. I want to talk a little bit about your experience in terms of protecting non-architectural resources. The intangible, I think, is the way you've referred to them, Dominique, in your presentation at the beginning of the program. How do we begin to talk about those resources and more effectively recognize them in our communities? Chris, let me turn to you first, and then delighted to hear from Dominique and Ken as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, excuse me, it's an interesting question, and it's a real challenge. One of my colleagues in preservation here in New York City describes our preservation tools here as a toolbox full of hammers, and that we don't really have the frameworks and the tools that we need to grapple with different types of neighborhoods, different types of small L landmarks. How do we protect a building that is historically important but architecturally compromised, or by traditional standards not architecturally significant? And I think we haven't done enough in New York City to grapple with that and to get beyond our strong and nation-leading a landmarks law that we point to with pride, to think about what other tools we need. And I think we need to look outside of New York to see what other places are doing. San Francisco has a legacy business program to recognize commercial uses that are historically important. And that's something that comes up a lot in New York, and we don't yet have something like that. And there are, many other examples, and I'm sure Ken and Dominique can add to that from their perspective. So I'll let them answer that as well.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a very important issue in LA as well. I don't want to paint a completely rosy picture. We have a long way to go in Los Angeles, as other cities do, and especially rectifying some of the disparities in terms of what gets recognized, whose history gets designated in the city, our percentage of sites using our traditional designation tools, representing communities of color in Los Angeles is still way below what it should be. But we are beginning to broaden our conception of what are the tools. I think traditionally our tools have been limited to the hammer, as you've said, and trying to develop a broader set of tools. We have extended our partnership with the Getty that we began through Survey LA to recently launch a new Los Angeles African American Historic Places project that explicitly is really kind of looking at all of our processes and practices in historic preservation locally through an anti-racist lens, and explicitly wanting to develop an array of tools, particularly for intangible heritage. We are developing a legacy business program in partnership with our economic development department in the city that looks to San Francisco and San Antonio and other cities that have developed that. And I think wanting to do more with cultural asset mapping and interpretation of cultural assets more broadly, where we've been more limited to the built environment previously. So we're definitely trying to move in that direction, but I would admit we have a long way to go.
Dominique,
Sure. So Philadelphia, I'm pleased to say that the ordinance in Philadelphia actually includes cultural heritage. But as a sitting member of the Historical Commission, it was one of those things that everyone grappled with. How do you regulate it? Because you're not, as an agency, you're protecting it, but what are you protecting, and what are the mechanisms? How much change is allowed, and have that sort of history, that memory still live? As part of the survey project that is currently being designed for the city, one of the requirements is to figure out how to map and identify these historic places that are culturally significant, and there may not be architecture there. I'm currently doing a project in West Palm Beach, and it's in Florida, not Palm Beach, West Palm Beach, and it's a African-American neighborhood that's really at the edge of downtown and is really threatened by development. And the city said, we don't want to cause harm, and we want to include all the places that are important, or protect all the places that are important to the residents. And architecturally, they've mapped it. They know which buildings were there at the important time period, and what has integrity and what doesn't. And I said, we just need to sit down and talk to people. It turns out there was a lynching in this neighborhood, and God forbid we put a club, they build something on that site that is disrespectful, whether or not there's a piece of architecture there today or not. That has to be recognized as a place of memory. And I don't have the right word for it. And I think part of the problem is we're trying to use brick and mortar words for something that may not be brick and mortar. and I think it's also one of these, our vocabulary tends to put off a lot of people in terms of acceptance and giving them the opportunity to remember places in a way that's important to them.
We are actually getting to the end of our hour, believe it or not. It's gone by in a second, and we probably could spend a whole other hour talking about this topic. But before we let our, especially our representatives Philadelphia and Los Angeles go, I want to turn to you both with a lightning round question, and that is, if you were to give New York City any advice about what it might do to incorporate historic preservation and so on into its our hopeful comprehensive plan at some point or another, what would it be? Ken, I'm going to turn to you first, and Dominique, you get the last word.
Well, I think, we've looked to New York for a long time, and admired the strength of your preservation program. I mean, I always benchmark our budget against, I know there's always complaints that your LPC doesn't have enough budget and staffing, but it's about, I think about 5 times what we have in Los Angeles. So, and the strength of the local preservation community, the network of community-based organizations that you have, it just, from afar, it seems to me, it just needs to be kind of pulled together. And if there's a strong tradition of having an independent LPC and you're not going to merge preservation and planning, at least to have a thoughtful approach to using survey work as the basis for a well-coordinated, intentional community planning process that really infuses that type of those types of historic preservation data and information into the long-range planning process. So I don't want to tell you how to organize your local government. That can happen in a lot of institutional ways, but I think that you need to be intentional about linking preservation, survey work, and planning.
Thank you, Dominique.
I'm only going to agree. I think all of these No, I think all of these things are really intrinsically linked, and it also has to be very much a public process. And every neighborhood response, as in the 197A plans, every neighborhood response is different. And unless you have boots on the ground and ask the questions about what's important, it's hard to start to frame how to shape your comprehensive plan, as well as how you're ultimately going to protect I won't even use the word historic resources. I'll just say resources, because I think it's a much broader set of things that matter to people. And I would also suggest that landmarks law is fabulous. You guys did a great job, but maybe you need something that's a step down from that can broaden your tent and bring more people to a place where it's not quite so expensive to comply, which will then increase the level of compliance. And you may not get the same level of finicky detail, but by the same token, you save the building. Who cares about the window?
Well, thank you all. This has been a really fabulous conversation. I've been riveted, and I hope our audience has been as well. I can't thank Ken and Dominique and Chris enough for your insights tonight. And allowing your experiences to frame here what might be happening as we move forward in New York. We very much appreciate it. New York City has a very strong landmarks law, but we also need to learn from the very strong experiences that have been happening in other cities across the United States and frankly around the world as well. I also want to thank my colleagues at MAS for their work in pulling this event together, their ongoing research and advocacy for a more coordinated and community-based planning system in New York City. And on that note, I have to say that we're very excited that MAS will be releasing a new policy brief in the next couple of days on comprehensive planning in New York City, and it will be informed by the sessions that we've had as part of this series, as well as cities, land use models and studies in London, Vancouver, London, and Minneapolis, and now Philadelphia and LA as well. And we look forward to sharing that with you. Please be sure to hit subscribe on mas.org, and you'll receive it hot off the presses when it is released later this week. MAS intends to do further sessions in this series that will delve into more topics that touch on comprehensive planning, and we hope that you'll join us for those. I hope that if you're not already a member of MAS, you'll consider joining. Your membership dollars and donations help us to continue to provide programming like this and to support our continued policy and advocacy work. In fact, now through December 31st, you can double your impact by supporting MAS's mission towards a more livable city. Any donations and membership contributions will be matched dollar by a challenge grant for the MAS Board of Directors up to $50,000. We hope that you'll stay tuned for upcoming MAS programming and tours, from a festival holiday tour on Arthur Avenue in the Bronx on December 11th, to Manhattanville, the heart of West Harlem, on December 18th. We have many more opportunities to explore this great city this month. All of our best tour guides are on the MAS programs and tours page. So by all means, take a look and choose whatever will be best for you. And we also hope that you'll join us tomorrow night for a discussion about the history and construction of the Brooklyn Bridge in 3D. Find out more by visiting mas.org/events. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you again. We look forward to seeing you next time.